cases and also the relevant theory in between and review of literature in the end. Starting with the history, the patient was a 4-year-old female, and the parents were complaining of noticing a white growth over the black part of the eyes, which was gradually increasing in size. The patient had a history of pterygium excision with amniotic membrane grafting elsewhere 2 years back. They had the reports in which the histopathology showed fibrovascular pannus, and then the patient had undergone right eye symblepharon release with SLET after 1 year. She also had a history of left eye pseudopterygium excision with AMG and SLET 1.5 years back. Also, Also, on general examination, there was a scar on her sternal area, and on asking the history, she had a history of removal of a skin lesion at the age of 1 year, which now was an ugly scar. The birth and the family history were insignificant. So, coming to the it is a rare diagnosis. Like, although the first case was reported way back in 1865, but till date there are only around 100 cases of corneal keloids reported in the literature. So, as we all know, it is a benign proliferation of fibrous or fibrovascular tissue in the corneal stroma, and it presents as a single enlarging white elevated well circumscribed corneal lesion with glistening surface. So as opposed to the keloids, which is commonly seen in the skin, which is usually pink in color, this is a white glistening mass. Coming to the etiopathogenesis, children and young adults are usually affected more, and although there are some reports saying that the incidence is common, like is equal in both males and females, there are a few articles stating that the males are more commonly affected than females. It usually occurs post trauma or surgery, though there have been cases where no such history was present. It is associated with Rubiola-Lawes syndrome, which is oculocerebrorenal syndrome, and Rubinstein-Tybee syndrome. So there is pathologically there is poorly controlled overproduction of collagen by activated corneal fibroblasts. So it is an exaggerated healing response of the corneal stroma. Now, there are a few hypotheses behind the pathogenesis of keloids, amongst which the earliest ones were by Pansons and Fuchs, who stated that the corneal hypertrophic scars originate from the stromal cells of the iris, which have been incarcerated by either trauma or surgery. So, and Holbach et al. And Megia et al. They stated that corneal keloids originate from the corneal stroma. It can follow surgery, or they can even be present from like they can even present after birth without any history of trauma or surgery. Some common ocular associations seen with corneal keloids are peripheral anterior synechia, anterior segment dysgenesis, aniridia, cataract with anophthalmia. So this is small questions for the fellows if anybody would like to take up. What are the investigations that you would like to do in cases of in case where like a patient presents with a corneal mass? Okay, so we go ahead with it. So even though the photographs are not exactly an investigation, but they can be useful clues to the presentation, because many a times, as we will see in this case, the patient is completely normal at birth. The eyes are completely normal to look at, and then they have, like, when we see the serial photographs, we can see a white encroaching mass on the cornea. B scan, which in our case was normal, useful for the posterior segment of the eye in cases where it's not visible. ASOCT and UVM are useful tools. ASOCT to know the extent, the depth of the lesion. It also is useful to know whether there are any cystic spaces, the consistency of the lesion basically, which we'll see in the surgical video in this case. And also UVM to rule out angle anomalies and depth of the lesion again. So this was our case. As you can see, the serial photographs which the parents were happy to share with us. At birth, the patient was normal. At 1 year of age, we can see a white uh, lesions just like pterygium encroaching on the cornea in both the sides. She had no history of trauma or surgery beforehand, and on presentation, she had this white mass which was like protruding from the corneal surface in both the eyes. Also, what we noted was this gingival hyperplasia, which has not been reported. I mean, it is not reported frequently with keloids. The only association which we could find was gingival hyperplasia can be a complication to the anticonvulsants if the patient is having seizure disorder. But in our case, there was no such history. The patient was like there was no history of systemic illness in our patient. This was just a finding that we would like to add. This was the ASOCT.
And Hiren? Hiren?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Hiren, yes, just curious to know, did you volunteer and look for it, or were the parents, I just want to know if the parents shared about the gingival hyperplasia or you noticed it?
During the routine examination, we've found out parents didn't share this history. And this photo was taken during the exam, like EUA, while the child was getting intubated. So coming to the ASOCT on presentation, the right eye was not possible as the child was not fixating because of the lesion. However, we have the ASOCT for the left eye, which shows the dense scarring on the corneal surface and the depth of the lesion. This was taken during the surgery, the biopterin, which also shows a similar protruding mass on the cornea with scarring. So coming to the differential diagnosis, hypertrophic scar, epibulbar dermoid, pterygium are the common differentials. Rare differentials which have been stated in the literature are conjunctival myxoma and fibrous histiocytoma. So talking about hypertrophic scar, as we all know, it respects the boundaries of the preceding insult. If there has been an injury, it usually does not cross the site of the margins of the preceding injury, and it spontaneously regresses or stays like status quo with time. Epibulbar dermoid has the presence of other tissues. It can be conjunctival, limbal, or corneal, and there have been there are associations, as we all know, like golden heart syndrome in cases of epibulbar dermoid. Conjunctival myxoma is a gelatinous fleshy lesion over the conjunctiva, and on histopathology, it can be differentiated from keloid with the presence of spindle and stellate shaped cells, which is not seen in the case of corneal keloid. Fibrous histiocytoma is one of the rare differentials, and pterygium, as we will see in the second case, which was managed by RR ma'am. So coming to the surgical video, I'll just play the video.
Just 1 second, just stop. Yeah. So just to kind of make a gist of the case, one, when you see a patient or a child with a lesion on the cornea, the most important thing that you would need to know is whether it was there from birth or it developed subsequently. And when you're looking at the differential diagnosis, if you're looking at dermoid, obviously it will be there from birth. If you're looking at a pterygium kind of a lesion, generally it will not be from birth, even though you do have a subset called as a congenital slim-blepharon variant, which is a type of partial cryptophthalmos variant, where you do get a band of conjunctivalization over the cornea, somewhat similar to the picture of the eye that was showed at 1 year. But in this child, the first photo was absolutely normal. So the child was absolutely normal. When you are looking at a dermoid, it is also sometimes associated with anti-segment dysgenesis, and it can be associated even with some kind of a limbal deficiency. That probably explains the conjunctivalization in both the eyes of this child without any trauma or surgery preceding it, unlike the second case where of Dr. RR's, where the patient had a a cataract surgery done, and there was a recurrence of there was a presence of the pterygium at the site of the incision for cataract. Here, there was no history of surgery before this pterygium developed, and the patient underwent pterygium surgery elsewhere and then presented with multiple severe recurrence of the keloid tendency. So, if you're looking at any of the anterior segment dysgenesis, they'll normally be seen in patients with congenital keloid. So in terms of classification, types of keloids, you have either in terms of a congenital keloid, you have a secondary keloid or a primary keloid. A congenital keloid is present from birth. When it is after birth, it could either be a primary or a secondary. A secondary is when it is associated with a known trauma or inflammation or infection. A primary is when you do not get any relevant history suggestive of it. It is most likely secondary, but we are not able to elicit a history which clearly points to the onset of the problem. Yeah, you can go ahead with the video, Hiren.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so basically the surgical process, this is almost like there is no limbus here. Everything is stuck to the cornea. There's a thick scar tissue on the cornea. So we did a peritomy. We tagged the muscle to know the anatomy properly. We debulked the tissue under the conjunctiva in the periphery, and then we started working on the cornea to try to remove the scar tissue. Unlike normal pannus, which kind of peels off pretty easily once you reach the plane, here it's a very ill-organized mass of tissue. So it was not peeling off as easily, and there was a lot of sharp dissection that needed to be done to kind of get to a plane which at least gave us a appearance of normal cornea. And we utilized that plane to initiate and continue our dissection forward. At one point, as we were dissecting, there was an escape of fluid underneath it, from the tissue, which we felt was probably a perforation, but then we realized that it was the cyst, one of the cysts in the keloid tissue itself, which had ruptured, and the underlying cornea was still intact. So we kind of dissected gradually and tried to peel off the scar tissue as much from the underlying cornea. Bleeders were cauterized using limited cautery. And it was a very thick and very tough tissue to dissect and cut, unlike what you would get normally even in chemical injuries when you're peeling off a pannus, or even in SJS. It tends to peel off with a lot more ease. So the problem here was twofold. Once we peel it off, we needed to be sure as to what the underlying corneal thickness is, because this tissue itself was so thick, we were not sure what the thickness of the cornea is, and the underlying cornea was also scarred. So we had to go deeper and debulk the cornea to improve the optical clarity of the cornea. And the second was there had to be a source of limbus, because the limbus was completely destroyed by the entire inflammatory process that the eye has undergone. So we decided to do a large corneoscleral graft with the limbus, so that we have a source of the limbus. We are replacing the cornea also, and the rest of the ocular surface was draped with the amniotic membrane. So this was the site where there was a perforation, where there was the fluid which was coming out. We were not sure what we were dealing with. So the thought process behind this has to be very clear, that you have to replace each. The OCT, if we were able to get the OCT before we started, we would have been a lot more comfortable. But since it was such a protuberant lesion, the OCT could not give us the depth of the keloid as such. A UBM in this child was not possible because she was not cooperating. So we are then marking out a 13 mm making a groove and then using Westcott scissor to initiate the dissection on one side. And then we used a combination of Vanas and crescent to remove off the scarred cornea and debulk the cornea so that we get to a reasonably clear interface. The other thing was, because there is a high possibility of recurrence once you have a keloid and you are touching these eyes. Also, this was an eye with so much of symblepharon, absent, reduced fornicial depth, and we have dissected it almost till the muscle on all the four areas. So we decided to, in addition to the LK and the amniotic, we also applied intraoperative mitomycin deep in the fornices to reduce the possibility of symblepharon. The concentration of mitomycin used was 0.04% for a duration of 3 minutes. So when you're dissecting it at the this kind of a tissue or any of the scar tissue over the cornea, sometimes it is difficult to peel it off. So if you try to get some kind of a plane at the limbal area, it gives you a reasonable guide as to the depth and as well as control over the amount of tissue that is removed. So we're deepening the area and then we use Vanas to dissect and remove off the anterior corneal layer. You can fasten it if possible.
Yes, sir. Is the screen visible?
Yeah, screen is visible.
Okay.
Bhaskar, can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
So I think the preliminary diagnosis would have been secondary limbal stem cell deficiency only, no? This will be your diagnosis, right? When you see such a
keloid with a limbal deficiency.
With a limbal deficiency.
Yes.
It's not only keloid.
Yeah. The only thing is whether the limbus was already unhealthy, because that's the reason why the patient developed bilateral pterygium on both the sides as such, or it was some kind of, if there was any history of trauma and then everything had happened, then it would have been secondary. So it is probably partly primary limbal deficiency and then the keloid, and both have actually aggravated the condition. So this point, we've just placed the mitomycin sponge after I have done the graft, because I didn't want the mitomycin to kind of seep onto the bed, because my recipient bed, what I felt was only about 150 odd micron thickness. It was not till the DM, because I didn't attempt a big bubble and I didn't want to go very deep in this case because I didn't want to end up with a perforation. So the rest of the area, we are just using amniotic and sticking it with fibrin glue, and cut off the amniotic which is there on top of the graft, because that is anyway not going to stick. Make sure that you tuck it into the fornix and make sure that it is nicely stuck. You can sweep that surface with a muscle hook to ensure the graft stays, amniotic graft stays nicely on the bulbar surface. And then we placed a contact lens and did a tarsorrhaphy so that the contact lens doesn't fall off.
Hi, Bhaskar. Mamta here. Can I ask some question here? Hi, Bhaskar. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Mamta.
Hi. Would intra-op slit lamp examination would give you an idea of the cornea, like when once we remove the keloid, now it's like where we suspect that it's 150 watt. Did you dissect another layer from the cornea, or you?
Yeah, I dissected a layer till I got a reasonable clear view. And once you are using the dissecting instruments, or you're using your spatula to kind of free the tissue, the ease at which your spatula enters the pocket, you know that you are reasonably deep enough. You can use a handled slit lamp, but handled slit lamp doesn't give you as good a slit image for us to be able to evaluate the thickness. The other option would be to use the OCT bioptigen intra-op to look at the residual bed. But here, since I was in a reasonably clear plane and the ease of my dissection, I was sure that I have close to about 150 odd microns. It was not going in so easily, like I'm very close to the DM, but it was not so difficult also once I peeled off the top layer.
Because the pre-op OCT did not give us any idea about, because the keloid was really big enough.
Yeah, so the first dissection was only to debulk the keloid.
Yeah.
The second dissection was also because I once I had that small rupture of the fluid, I didn't want to remove off all the thing at the single stretch. So the second debulking was also of the keloid. And finally, when I marked the corneal side and I used a 15 number blade to kind of deepen that edge, so that again gives me an idea as to how deep I'm going, because I kind of scratch and go close to about 200 odd microns, 250 microns from that my trephination area. And then I use Vanas or your crescent blade to initiate the dissection plane. And when you're using that, if you use a spatula to kind of initiate your plane, you can get an idea about how easily the spatula moves in the dissected pocket. That gives you a clue as to how deep you are.
Yeah. So probably the patient had a low Pachy of the cornea. If you think that the keloid was just an additional.
Everything is keloid is partly cornea also. So it is like if you look at the left eye OCT, just to put the left eye OCT.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Not the bioptigen, the previous one. So here you are actually seeing there's an epithelium which is intact, and then this entire reflective surface is the keloid, because your arrangement of collagen structures are no longer normal. So it is partly involving the cornea. So it is very difficult to say whether it's keloid. It's sitting on top of the cornea and you have a normal cornea underneath, because it involves all the layers of the cornea.
So we have removed a part of cornea in the keloid, and then we have second layer 100, 150 and the base, then that's what we think about.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So coming to the histopathology of the sample, it showed a scarred, like an exaggerated scarred fibrovascular collagenous tissue which were irregularly arranged. And so coming to the pathology, there are three hallmark signs of corneal keloids on histopathology, which are epithelial hyperplasia, usually absent Bowman's layer, and depending on the stage of the keloid, the stromal changes can be like, but one commonly found arrangement is haphazardly arranged collagen. Irregularly arranged collagen fibers with scanty myofibroblasts, and on immunohistochemistry, the myofibroblasts stain positive for smooth muscle actin and vimentin. So this was the bioptigen 1 week post-DALC, which showed a nicely attached DALC graft with the bed with a slight central stromal irregularity. This was the bioptigen 6 weeks post-DALC. This is the post.
How much was the bed, Bhaskar, now? After this?
I will come to that. Okay. So in fact, bioptigen actually has a much higher resolution. So if you look at the
The Zeiss OCT, you can see a little bit of a reflectivity here, and with this OCT, I would have probably said it looks absolutely. I mean, it's acceptable for the surgery that I did. But when you look at the bioptigen, you realize how inadequate your smoothness was when we actually dissected it. But this tissue was actually very. It was not so easy to peel off. So normally, when you go deeper and deeper, it tends to peel off pretty easily. That's why you get a very smooth bed. Here, there was so much of irregular scar tissue that even when we went deeper and deeper, it was not peeling off as smoothly as what we would ideally want. So I still had to do a little bit of sharp dissection in the center. Normally, I wouldn't do sharp dissection in the center. It would only be blunt dissection, where I would just use my spatula to kind of tease off the fibers. But that was not the case here, indicating the irregular stromal arrangement even at a deeper plane. If you look at the slit lamp, the microscope photos intra-op, it looks pretty normal. Post-op picture, there is this haze is more of the epithelium rather than anything in the interface. So clinically, when we look at the eye, the interface doesn't seem to be that affected as such. Zeiss OCT also, the interface doesn't seem to be that significantly affected. But with bioptigen, because of the higher resolution, it shows up the central areas where there has been a slight difference in dissection plane between the periphery and the center.
So what was the thickness in this bioptigen? Can we know?
I think it was somewhere around, zoom kar.
So 190,
200, approximately 200 microns.
And when we see the histopathology, did that histopathology what Hiren just described, did we also see the same?
Yeah, we saw the same tissue? In addition, because KK also saw lacrimal glands. So he actually first reported it as a congenital anomaly, like a abnormal tissues in the normal place. But then I told him that this is not, this was only from the cornea. So then we were wondering whether the previous surgeries that the patient has had has actually, and the conjunctival scarring has caused a drag on the lacrimal gland which has come, or it is probably the accessory lacrimal glands that he is actually reporting. So I told him that it's probably the accessory lacrimal glands which you are reporting, because the lacrimal gland is very well in position in that patient. It didn't come anywhere close to the cornea, but the entire structure was significantly altered.
Yeah, but we did see corneal tissue, because we are thinking that a part of the cornea is intact in these keloids.
Yes, the deeper you go, the deeper part will see the structure where you have the keloid. Your architecture of the cornea is completely lost. You have stromal fibers which are in irregular arrangements.
Yeah.
As you go deeper, there will be an area where you will have some amount of regularity with respect to the stromal fibers, where you will be able to see some patches of. The only thing is, if you were able to get the entire thing as a single block, I dissect and take the entire thing out.
Yeah,
that would have been the best way. But with this kind of an irregular surface, without knowing the base, it becomes difficult. Other way would have been to have an intra-op OCT.
Yeah, that will give you more. Do you think when we do a DALC with a Melis technique, we get a better plane than when we do like this, a bubble or this thing? Do you think so?
Not really. Even with the Melis's technique or with a bubble, you probably get the best, because it's cleaving it off as such. With the Melis's technique, the advantage is you keep following up the posterior. So it's like creating your SICS tunnel or creating your phaco tunnel, but you have to be very careful that you follow the architecture of your corneal inner layer, so that you are maintaining the curvature across when you go across the apex of your cone. Both of them in this case is not possible, because DALC you can't inject anything in this eye because of the irregular architecture. And Melis is also, you need a visibility for you to move your instruments in, which is not possible here. So here the only way was to do a manual layer by layer dissection. The deeper you go, you get a better idea, and you can actually go very deep in the periphery and try to peel it off. My idea here was not to be, because I was going to be putting in a large, almost like a 12 mm graft. I didn't want to have a perforation by trying to go too deep. So that is why I decided to leave a little bit of stroma rather than try to be heroic, because if I ended up with a rupture in such a large graft in a child, in a patient with a keloid, then I might end up significantly affecting the final outcome.
Sure. Very nice. Thanks.
This is the intra-op photo, which was taken 2 days back, 3 months post the clear post DALC, and there was a clear graft with a slight epithelial defect, where for which we did AMT.
So 1 second. So this basically was the interface was still clear, but there was a defect here, probably because of the allogenic limbus as such. Compared to the previous photo, just go back at 1 week, which we had taken, where the eye looks absolutely white and quiet. This was probably also an effect of the mitomycin that was put. So because next slide. So there was a little bit of a congestion. So we were a little bit concerned whether there's a recurrence of the keloid, which is happening in the conjunctiva with increased fibrosis, but it seemed to be more related to a focal area of epithelial defect, which is probably related to either an epithelial rejection or a breakdown because of minimal limbal stress in that area, because that is the lower part of the eye, because of exposure that it can break. So we put a contact lens first for the patient. In a couple of days, the defect started healing, but just to be able to initiate the healing faster, we went ahead with an amniotic, because anyway we had to remove the loose sutures also. So since we were taking the child up for GA, we went ahead with an amniotic and put a contact lens back. To reduce the recurrence of fibroblastic proliferation, again we've given an injection 5-FU again at this time. That is, we had given the first injection of 5-FU 1 week post-op. We repeated it now in 3 months post-op. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yes, sir. So coming to the review of literature and highlighting the management options and outcomes. So this was a case report by Borsier et al., who reported a case of 70-year-old male with a history of ocular trauma and subsequently cataract surgery for the traumatic cataract. He presented with a corneal keloid and was treated with superficial keratectomy with AMG, and there was no recurrence reported at 1 year. The second case report, which had a similar surgery with our case, was reported by Al-Katan et al. In an 80-year-old male with a history of cataract and glaucoma surgery, and he was managed with simple excision and AMG. And he also reported subepithelial fluid-filled cysts, just like we saw in our surgery. And but there was a follow-up of only 2 weeks. This was another case report by Lee et al., who reported 4 cases, all of whom underwent superficial keratectomy, some only once and some multiple times, but all of them recurred after like 4 months, 6 months, and 10 months. This was a case report by Lee et al. In a 36-year-old male with a history of trauma with no recurrence, and he also had undergone superficial keratectomy. This is unique because in this 2 cases were reported by Bakhtiari et al. The first case was a 21-year-old male who had no risk factors but still had presented with a corneal keloid and was treated by superficial keratectomy, followed by recurrence after 1 year, who underwent 2 more superficial keratectomies, only to be finally treated by DALC. The second case was a 24-year-old male who had no significant history, but was treated with superficial keratectomy followed by PK at the age of 9 and 13 years. He was lost for follow-up for 11 years, following which a type 1 K-Pro was done. And still there was a recurrence of keloid in the donor cornea 18 months after this K-Pro surgery. But the patient was asymptomatic and was left as such. This is a case report by Gupta et al., who reported 5 cases, all of whom were managed with superficial keratectomy, but there were no recurrences reported in this case series. So this, I would just like to know the opinion of moderators in this case, whether superficial keratectomy can be an option in treating keloids, because the review of literature is quite controversial.
You don't have any ideal treatment. Superficial keratectomy might work
combining it with mitomycin might probably work by reducing the fibroblastic proliferation, but none of the treatment options are foolproof. The cases where superficial keratectomy alone has worked have all generally had a very short follow-up period. Even with a lamellar keratoplasty, there will be a gradual repopulation of the donor by the host cells, which could lead to keloid. Keloid can come. The definition of keloid is basically that it can come at any point of time after a trauma. It need not, unlike a hypertrophic scar, which normally occurs, say, immediately after trauma, keloid can develop even years after a trauma in that particular area. So follow-ups of most of these cases are pretty low. The only advantage of an LK to a certain extent is because you are not having any of the recipient cells in the donor button. It might take a little bit longer for the keloid to involve the visual center as compared to just doing a superficial keratectomy. And again, it depends also on the thickness of your residual cornea. So in our case, if the underlying cornea was clear and it was reasonably thick, we wouldn't have done an LK. We would have just done an amniotic and we would have done a mitomycin application maybe to the corneal surface like we do for an epilastic procedure, but maybe for a slightly longer duration of time, and would have observed to see for any recurrences. You will need to control the inflammation also in a much more aggressive manner in these eyes. So you would need to put the patient on systemic steroids, or if, like in our case, we have put the patient on topical tacrolimus because they couldn't afford mycophenolate mofetil as such. We didn't have a choice. But ideally I would have, because we've put limbus, we've done so much of a dissection. You're looking at trying to salvage the epithelium. You're looking at trying to reduce the inflammation. So I would have preferred to put the patient on topical mycophenolate also. We did give a course of systemic mycophenolate also. We did give a course of systemic steroids to the patient in the early postoperative period.
Bhaskar, can I add something here?
Yeah. Sure.
All these papers, Hiren, when they talk about superficial keratectomy, do they also talk about OCT and what was the depth of your keloid? Like in our patient, we cannot see the posterior stroma, so it was pretty thick. And that's when you decide that DALC is a good option. But when we do a superficial keratectomy, would an OCT and a superficial keloid let us decide between superficial keratectomy and DALC? Bhaskar?
Yeah, it would. See, like in the left eye OCT that we saw, again, you can see the scarring is much deeper.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a very focal keloid in one area which is not involving the visual center, and even if you have a scar there, it is okay. It doesn't make a difference. You might just go ahead and do a superficial keratectomy. But if there is a scar in the, it's there exactly in the center of your cornea, then you will have to consider an LK. Like here, this is keloid, and superficial keratectomy is not going to leave behind sufficient corneal thickness even in the left eye for us to just leave it like that, because this is going to be somewhere close to around 250 to 300 microns of thickness alone. Exactly. So you would need an OCT to help you plan. So unless it's a very superficial opacity, or it is off the visual axis, it is, say, closer to the limbus. Yeah. So sometimes it can be associated with dermoid. So if it's closer to the limbus, you might just scrape that area off with a superficial keratectomy, apply mitomycin to that area. And if it doesn't recur, you have a faint scar there also, it's fine. It's acceptable because your visual axis is clear.
Sure. I think that answers Hiren's question when he said that there's a controversial opinion between superficial keratectomy and DALC. While in superficial keratectomy is probably considered because they were maybe more superficial lesions and you have a good host tissue which is surviving. So you don't really need to do a DALC. Whereas in our case, where we have a DALC and it's a deeper lesion, a superficial keratectomy obviously is not a choice.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So coming to the second differential of corneal keloids, this was a case which was managed by RR ma'am. This patient is a 3-year-old child who had a history of congenital cataract in both the eyes. There was no history or documentation of any growth in either eyes on presentation, and the patient underwent cataract surgery at the age of 4 months, lensectomy, and was kept aphakic. The patient's parents noticed growth on the cornea 15 months post cataract surgery, and recently left like a month back. Left eye pterygium excision with conjunctival autograft with EMG was done. You can see the pictures on the left hand side. This is the post-op first day picture. So the take-home message of this presentation is pathological diagnosis for corneal.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Just that pterygium was there before lensectomy. What was the? Sorry, just tell me that part.
So I can probably answer that question. According to the parents, parents feel there was a lesion from birth, but can't really trust the history. The pediatric surgery was done here, lensectomy was done here. So pediatric ophthalmologist consultant is a fairly senior consultant. So she was very sure that there was no pterygium noted at the time of lensectomy. After that, when the patient came for a review after about, I don't know exact duration, few months later, I think, or maybe a year later, they noted that there was a very early pterygium, but it was not going beyond the limbus. Patient did not come for 2 years thereafter. So when the patient presented now a month and a half ago, there were visually significant pterygium. So you can take it that it was probably not there at the time of lensectomy. That's how I would look at it. So the point here are that the reason why I thought I'll put this in, because these both cases were happening almost simultaneously. When I was talking to Bhaskar, I knew he was going to present this case. One, I have never seen a bilateral nasal temporal pterygium in both eyes in a young child. This child is only 3 years old, number one. So if you look at literature, there are very, very few reports about early onset pterygium, less than 16 years of age. And what is postulated is whether there is a genetic factor leading to this, or whether there's an environmental influence, which is very difficult to say in a 3-year-old child. The other sibling of this child is normal, and there is no positive family history as well. That's the first point. The second point is that there is a small hypothesis that if there was an intraocular inflammation at some point of time, there is a possibility that there is some degeneration of the nerve that's happening, which is causing alteration in the cornea, which is causing the conjunctiva to grow over. But these are all theoretical, nothing is proven. In this particular child, the concern was about the surgery itself, because it was in both eyes, it was involving the visual axis. So we had to do the surgery. We were also worried about whether this could also have a keloid-like response, because if this was initiated after the lensectomy, was there a reason with minimum inflammation that triggered this kind of a response? Because it was bilateral from the area of probably the area of side ports, did that incite the inflammation leading to the pterygium? There is no answer to this question, but number one. There's only one other report where there is a bilateral nasal temporal pterygium in a very young child, where they have not had any surgery, but have postulated that there was a localized limbal stem cell deficiency. Would that have been the reason for the pterygium? So there is no other case like this with this presentation. The inflammation that the lensectomy could have triggered is a postulate, can't really prove it, but the pterygium was a classical primary pterygium and was proven histopathologically as a primary pterygium. Now the second concern is about the surgery itself. So because of this keloid patient, we were also thinking that, there is a possibility that this child could also react differently, because post lensectomy, if this had happened, which we really don't know, there is also a possibility that the child can react, can also have a keloid-like response. So what we decided was to use I used intraoperative mitomycin in this child, but I was really scared because there is no report and you're always worried about the sclera and cornea. The important point during surgery that I found a little different was that the cornea is a little more flexible, so to dissect it off the surface was a little difficult, number one. Second, you need a larger graft. I took it from the superior temporal quadrant. I did not touch the limbus because it was a very small child. So, and I split it into two and I put it. You probably want to take a slightly larger size graft because you have to account for the Tenon's contracture, which is possible in young children. And I used intraoperative mitomycin 0.04%. I only used it for 1 minute because I was very scared about the consequences, although I thoroughly washed it. And this being the first time, I just wanted to be sure that we have done whatever is possible to minimize the risk of recurrence. This child has come now. It came, I think, 2 days ago. He's doing well. So far, the surface, of course, I put amniotic, I put contact lens, we removed the lens. Child is doing well. At a 1 month review, there is no recurrence of the pterygium 4 now.
Just to, I mean, the only thing here is even my patient, if you look at the first picture, it was a normal eye, then had developed bilateral, both-sided nasal and temporal pterygium kind of a thing, which kind of progressed. So we always have to keep the possibility of a keloid tendency when you're, like Dr. RR said, when you deal with any very young patient with a prominent pterygium or with a very prominent corneal whitish lesion. The other differential diagnosis of a whitish lesion would be a Salzmann's nodular degeneration, but that's a little bit more subtle, and you can normally OCT will show you the bumps, and the rest of the eye looks reasonably normal. And again, you will probably not get it bilaterally, whereas most of the time when you have a keloid tendency, you tend to have changes in both the eyes.
Bhaskar, I have a question. Suppose this child had a tendency, how, like you said, it can happen immediately, it can happen later. But what is the average time that you can expect the response? Should it not be more in the immediate post-operative period than much later?
That is the thing when they differentiate or they try to differentiate between a hypertrophic scar and keloid tendency. They basically say that when you have a wound and you are having a reaction, it could just fit into a hypertrophic scar picture. But with a keloid tendency, even years down the line, you can have changes. The primary concern here is going to still be the inflammation, and it is going to be the cellular crosstalk between your fibroblast and their myofibroblastic conversion. In my patient as well as in your patient, probably to a certain extent, the mitomycin did work that we used intra-op once we touched the eye. Because if you look at if you look at my patient, the first surgery which was done was a slit along with the pterygium removal, which was done in LVP Bhubaneswar. And post that, there was a complete loss of the entire architecture of the cornea. And this was in both the eyes, she's kind of lost the architecture, more so in the right eye, but even the other eye is not at all healthy. And with a slit, I would have expected at least the epithelium to heal in 2 weeks' time. So there wouldn't have been a raw area as such. But in spite of that, there has been so much of a severe fibrotic scarring.
Yeah, so I think this patient also wanted the other eye surgery. There also is involving the visual axis after a couple of months, so that will give us some time to understand how this eye is responding.
The only other thing would be if there is any early recurrence of, because in your case, it's only been a pterygium kind of a thing. So if you first start seeing any focal recurrence, it might be good to give either a subconjunctival tricot or Dexa, or a subconjunctival 5FU in that area to reduce the fibroblastic proliferation. Because 5FU has been also been given for pterygiums as such. For primary pterygiums, it has been given, and it has also been given to reduce the size of pterygiums, secondary pterygiums, or very inflamed pterygiums to reduce the size of it before we take it up for surgeries.
One of the interesting thing I came across is some of very few reports of surgery in children, but many reports have just observed. It has been non-progressive. That's a little odd, I thought.
It kind of reaches a particular point and then it kind of stops unless you keep touching it. Yeah. But if it involves the visual axis, we don't have a choice.
You don't have a choice, correct. That's what happened in this case also.
Ma'am, what was the histology of your patient? This patient?
Classical primary pterygium, elastic region. Everything was, we have the pictures also. In fact, for want of time, I didn't put all the other investigations. We did complete workup of the patient. Histopathology shows typical of a primary pterygium.
So this was definitely different from what Bhaskar's patient had. Keloid.
This was a primary. That's why I wanted to put this case here, because it was histopathologically proven as a primary.
Yeah.
Ma'am, you would have written pterygium in your pathology report.
That's so mean, Bhaskar.
No, we have the histopath slides. We got it.
Any imprint you give, whatever you write, you will get the answer.
Yeah. Rama, can I say something?
Yeah.
So the only other connotation of a keloid that I can think about this time pertains to a very old patient of mine. He's no longer under follow-up. But the history of systemic or skin keloid, however rare it may be, is very important, when refractive surgery is concerned. I've had a patient very long back. I had done microkeratome LASIK in that patient, maybe around 15 years back. And what started off with an appearance of a diffuse lamellar keratitis snowballed into a scar, a typical central pearly elevated scar in the visual axis in both the eyes. Pumped him with steroids in all possible angles, and then it did not settle, it did not go completely, but it settled down like two little mini kidneys in the center of both the corneas. So history of keloid in the skin later was probed and asked from the patient. So if there is a skin keloid which is prominent, it's probably a relative, or in my opinion, an absolute contraindication for corneal laser vision correction procedures. The other question I had for Hiren was that I understand from your discussion that the exuberant nature of the scar, the extension beyond the limits of the injury, and the propensity to start even much later, not immediately after the insult, all that portray as keloid. But histopathologically, what you described, the disrupted collagen or the haphazard arrangement and those capillaries and all that, could be seen in any other badly organized scar also. So is the presence of the stain for myofibroblast the only histopathological differentiating feature, or is there any other way from histopath that we can say this is not a scar and this is a keloid?
So, depending on the stages of keloid, ma'am, it has been stated that in the early stages there will be more of myofibroblasts in the keloids, which may or may not be present in hypertrophic scars. And as in the latest stages of keloids, the myofibroblasts are scanty, and the irregularly arranged collagen fibers are more pronounced and can be easily made out on histopathology. And
now my
that's what-
question is there any hallmark of a keloid, either immunohistochemistry wise or histopathological appearance wise? Do you get these myofibroblasts in normal scars also, or are they pathognomonic? That Vimentin stain for myofibroblasts, is it pathognomonic of a keloid? Because the other parameters that you said in the
No, there is no
HPE
specific. I spoke to KK about that,
Right.
asking him whether he wants to do.
So it's basically the clinical correlation with
So
that
I spoke
particular
to
appearance in
Dr. KK
HPE.
once we sent the. Yes, there is no specific marker. I wanted him to at least send it for Vimentin and actin, saying that okay, if we have to at any point of time publish it, at least we get that. But he says no, he refused to send it. He says it's not. I'm sure it is. He first was giving a diagnosis only of a developmental anomaly because he saw lacrimal glands. But then I had to speak to him. I said that this was the previous picture, and we sent him all the photos of the child and said that clinically it is not a development, it's not a congenital anomaly, it is something. So then he re-looked at the slide, and then he says that then it fits into keloid is what. So we asked him whether we want to get the Vimentin also marker done, but he said it's not going to add on clinically because you don't have anything so specific to directly say it is keloid. You have to look at histopathology with the clinical picture.
So it's basically the exuberant nature and the extension beyond the limits and its propensity to come at any time that makes you think of a keloid. Because I did go through a bit of literature that Hiren had sent. Even though all the papers had classified all their patients as keloids, there was not any proper clear guideline to come to that diagnosis over and above the clinical appearance. So that's why I had that question.
Yes.
In
So
my
do we call it?
there was no, sorry, let me finish. In my child, there was no suggestion, skin related issues, nothing. We did get the history. So it may be important to get that history also when you see these unusual growth in very young children. Skin related issues were not there in the child. At least there was no scar and go ahead, Mamta.
Yeah. So do we think that it can be a genetic propensity and there may be some genetic link to the whole thing, that why do we not get it so often? Only few patients and very rare things that we get this keloid thing. Is there anything in literature about the genetic this thing? No.
Congenital pterygium, yes, but I don't know about.
No tendency
Keloid.
for a keloid formation and this kind of
There is a genetic propensity, yes, but I don't think we have very clear
Gene markers.
Gene markers specifically for it, because when you see it, you have it associated with certain syndromes. You have it certainly in certain families, or I mean, you can sometimes have siblings both
Sure.
having keloidal tendencies, but we don't have any clear markers to kind of prove or disprove the factor.
So that we can tell him any surgery he undergoes further, he might have a
Yeah.
recurrence, or his siblings, or if they
I mean,
if we know.
the best would actually be a skin keloid tendency. So because somebody, as long as it's not a child, not a very young child, people falling, getting hurt at any point of time, if they have a slightly more exaggerated healing response, you need to be careful.
Yeah, careful. And the other thing, Bhaskar, when you say that you can use these antifibrotic agents, 5-FU, you've used multiple in your surface clinics. Do you see any side effects like this scleral thinning and what we used to know that these can cause? So what is your experience?
The mitomycin that we use during phonics reconstruction is not placed on the bare sclera. It is placed on the vascular tenons as such in the periphery. So the problem with mitomycin comes if it's placed on the bare sclera or on that very small sliver of episcleral blood vessel, and that kind of also gets the vasculature gets shriveled, and then it becomes necrotic, or if there is a delay in the epithelialization in that area. In our cases, when we are doing a surface reconstruction, we are putting it in the phonics. So then our issues with scleral thinning is much lesser because rest of the surface gets epithelized pretty fast. As far as 5-FU is concerned, a 5-FU injection is given, if at all. 5-FU is not something that we've commonly given. I've just given it in this particular patient. I've given 2 injections to reduce the fibro. That we are already giving when the surface is already epithelized. There's no raw area as such. Mitomycin we've also given for a couple of OCP patients in the fornix occasionally, where we have not seen a response. The problem with mitomycin is when you apply it and leave the surface area bare, then if it doesn't epithelize fast, then the sclera starts melting.
So basically, we're pretty good at it then. Thanks,
Yeah.
Bhaskar.